Hello, everyone. My name is Anna Grzmabusa. I'm the director of the Europe Center here at Stanford University. I'd like to welcome you to a session of today on the New Party Challenge. We have two fantastic experts on political parties here at the Europe Center. Haughton Deegan-Krause, or KDK, as he's known to the many fans of his work, is an associate professor of political science at Wayne State University. And he spent more than 2 decades now studying political party competition and how the competition shapes party democracy. He's the author of several books and articles on political parties, their transformation, and how they influence politics more broadly. Tim Haughton is a senior associate professor of European politics at the University of Birmingham, where he's also been the head of the Department of Political Science and International Studies and the director of the Center for Russian, European, and Eurasian Studies. And despite these commitments, he is also the author of several books and articles, and his interests encompass electoral and party politics, electoral campaigning, and the role of the past in the politics of the present, especially as regards the politics of Slovakia, the Czech Republic, and Brexit. And both Tim and Kevin are also engaged with the policy world at all its levels and have been consultants, observers, and even practitioners of democratic politics. And so it is with great pleasure that we welcome them today to talk about their new book, The New Party Challenge, Changing Cycles of Party Birth and Death in Central Europe and Beyond. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. And welcome to everybody, wherever you're zooming in from. Good afternoon, good morning. And for those of us in Europe, good evening, even night, it feels like. It's 9 o'clock in the UK, but it's a real pleasure to be with you today. And I'd like to extend a big thank you to Kevin. Next slide. Kevin?
Yes, got it.
Yeah. So a big thank you to Anna and the organizers for arranging this. We really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you today. Now, at the beginning of our book, we start off with a story. And as I said, it's 9 o'clock in the UK. It's bedtime for a lot of kids. So we're going to start off by telling you a story. So please forgive me. I hope you're sitting comfortably. I shall begin. So once upon a time, there was a king who created a new political party, which he named after himself. He promised to clean up the country's politics, won more votes than anyone else, and became prime minister. But politics did not get much cleaner, and he did not win as many votes the next time. Almost no one lived happily ever after, except for his bodyguard, who created his own new party, promised to clean up the country's politics, won a lot of votes, and became prime minister. In a nearby country, there was a game show host who created a new political party. He dressed in funny outfits in campaign advertisements as a convict, a madman, a vampire, and a courtesan, in which he promised to clean up the country's politics. He won a large number of votes and became Speaker of Parliament. But politics did not get much cleaner, and his party fell apart when he was photographed drinking happily with a local mob boss. In a third country, not far away, there was a supermarket chain manager who became a big city mayor and created a new political party named after himself. He promised to clean up the country's politics and got more votes than anyone else. But politics did not get much cleaner, and his party fell apart when he was accused of corruption, and he did not win many votes the next time. One person who did was a prominent yet apolitical magistrate who formed a new political party named after himself, promised to clean up the country's politics, won more votes than anyone else, and became prime minister. But that apolitical magistrate saw his popularity fall, and at the next election, a comedian termed mayor, who formed a new party named after himself, promised to clean up the country's politics and became prime minister. Finally, in yet another country, located in between the three others, there was a fresh-faced politician from an established party who did not get a position he thought he deserved. He created a new party, promised to clean up the country's politics, and won a large number of votes. But when he did not get to be prime minister, he reorganized his party, built a strong organization, and promised to help those who were struggling economically. The next time, he got more votes than anyone else and became prime minister, and his party remained strong and powerful for a long, long time, until voters started to notice how corrupt it had become and started to look around for a different, fresh-faced politician who could clean up the country's politics. So that little fairy story of course, Kevin had the slides to go along with it, is not just a fairy story. It is actually a pretty accurate description of developments in Bulgaria, in Lithuania, in Slovenia, and in Slovakia. Kevin, can you move on to the party map? So, one of the things that we are seeking to do, a broader thing that we seek to do in this book, is to really understand party politics across Central and Eastern Europe from 1989 through until the end of 2019. And one of the things that we did initially was to map out the development of party systems. So this very simple looking diagram, for those of you used to American and British party politics, you might be quite surprised to see that this is actually the party map of Bulgaria. This complex picture in Bulgaria, and not just Bulgaria, if we also have a look then at Lithuania, this is the Lithuanian party system. If we then look at the Slovenian party system, this is what the Slovenian party system looks like. And finally, if we look at the Slovak party system, this is what party system looks like in Slovakia. And really what we set out in this book, the big goal is to try to explain party politics from 1989 onwards. But more specifically, we look at these maps and we realize that a lot of the existing explanations we found wanting. So we sought to try and find explanations, particularly for why a lot of parties come and go, live fast and die young, but some others manage to endure. Now, we called the book The New Party Challenge because there are, in essence, three challenges. There's the challenge that new parties face to start up and win votes. There's the challenge that new parties pose to the established parties. And there's the new challenge that all parties face, given the changing context of politics, technological developments, and the need to forge those ties that bind between the governing and those, between the governed and those who do the governing. And we make a number of arguments in the book, but three are worth flagging up here. We argue quite strongly that new parties are reshaping politics, not only in Central Europe, but around the world. By the way, I should say our definition of Central Europe covers the 11 states from Central and Eastern Europe that are now EU member states, so those 11 states. So not only in Central Europe, but around the world. While individual new parties usually die, new parties as a species, we suggest, are poised to endure. Secondly, we argue this is because newness is endogenous. And thirdly, we argue that these trends towards lightweight organization, anti-corruption appeal, celebrity leadership, make it easier to start parties, but harder for them to stay alive. And unless these new parties make these deliberate and difficult investments in longevity, we are likely to see a perpetuating link of cycles of birth and death. And in the book, there are some key themes that we, or key lessons that we emphasize. So we emphasize the importance of agency and choice. We talk a lot about how important time and time horizons are, both time in terms of diachronic and in synchronic. Thirdly, we emphasize strongly the clean against corrupt divide of politics. Fourthly, we argue that party birth and death are linked. And finally, we do argue that Slovenia is everywhere, well, at least to some extent. And we do suggest that actually Central Europe, a region that has often borrowed frameworks from Western Europe, that actually we think that Central and Eastern Europe can often offer frameworks to explain not just the rest of Europe, but other places as well. Just to say something about our research methods, basically it's a blend of quantitative and qualitative approaches. On the qualitative side, we went out into the field and visited over 100 party offices across the region. This is the famous Hnutie za demokratické Slovensko in Slovakia, but also next slide showing the Lithuanian Social Democratic Party. And we interviewed a number of officials and politicians from those parties. But also, in addition to that, and I should say, we visited even small little ones. So this is actually the headquarters of the party called TIP, which didn't last for very long. party offices in Banska Bystrica between a fishmonger's and a travel agent's. Well, it's better location than Four Season Landscaping, I suppose. But anyway, but in addition to that, we also drew on a lot of data sets, our own, but also Chapel Hill and also the Rohr Schneider Whitefield expert survey as well. And we used some aspects to do with R as well, which Kevin will mention later. So basically what we're going to try and do in the next 20 minutes is just to run through certain key things in the book. We'll take you through the book, but we'll focus in particular on the sections to do with birth and death. And also we'll talk a little bit towards the end about the wider lessons and the meaning of what we think is a bigger contribution of our book. So the first, or the last thing that I will say before I pass over to Kevin is just to say on the definition of new political parties, something Anna knows well. There's big debates and discussions within the study of Central and Eastern Europe. It is actually quite complicated, and it's quite complicated when you think about those complex party diagrams that we showed you. There's lots of splits and splinters and genuinely new parties and not genuinely new parties. What we would just say is that in the book, we assessed these different levels of party change. In the end, we settled on one particular threshold. What we can say, though, is that we ran our results using both stricter and looser definitions of newness and broadly found the same kind of story. But we're very happy to come back if anyone has a nerdy question about measurement in Q&A. And now I'm going to pass over to Kevin, who will do the middle bit, and I'll come back for the last 5 minutes or so at the end. Kevin.
Thanks, Tim. Appreciate it. Just want to make sure that everyone can hear me. So if I could get just a thumbs up from anyone out in the audience, if you could actually hear me. Yay, good. And just to elaborate on what Tim said, we were very conscious of the fact that different people define new party in very different ways. And so we wanted to make sure that all of the findings that we reached weren't based on a definition that others might say, well, that's not actually what a new party is. A new party is much more strict than that, or a new party category is much broader than that. So we developed a whole series of categories, and then we made sure that what we were doing, that the pattern stayed roughly the same, no matter whether we were very strict or very loose. And what we found was that those patterns indeed remained consistent across the different levels of strictness. So, more or less parties were in, but whether those more or less parties were in, the pattern stayed virtually identical. So what did we do? Well, once we figured out which parties belonged in and which parties belonged out, and again, this depends on which threshold you want to use, but the patterns look almost identical. We then looked to see how those parties did in particular elections in particular countries over time. And we used a system of aggregation so that we created 6 5-year periods between 1990 and 2019. And then we looked at the success of parties during those particular periods. And what you can see here is a graph. We call this sometimes our rainbow sunrise graph. But the idea of this graph is that each column shows the proportion of the vote in all of the countries, all of the elections that went to parties created during particular periods. And so, some of these parties were created in the very beginning. The dark purple ones were those created in the very beginning, and then the lighter purple were those created in the next 5-year period, and so on. And what you see is a kind of remarkable progression over time, that the parties created at the very beginning of the time period declined in every single election over time. And they were replaced by newer parties, and then those declined in every single election over time. And then those were replaced by new parties, and those declined in their share of the vote in every single election over time. And this actually happened with every single cohort in every single election. We didn't expect this to come out this cleanly, this beautifully, but every single time, every single cohort reduces, and that leaves space for new cohorts. As we're moving in already, we're getting data from 2021, 2020, 2021 that follows exactly the same pattern. So we're seeing this development, we're seeing this shrinking of each cohort. So new parties emerge and then they decline, and then new parties emerge and then they decline. And so our job was to sort of figure out what are the contours of that decline? What does that look like? And then ultimately, why does that happen? And what's the underlying mechanism? We looked at it in every single country in the region. And so this is the general pattern that you just saw, but you can actually see, we see virtually the same pattern in every country. And while it wasn't true that every single cohort declined in every single period in every single country, the overwhelming trend was of that decline. Very rarely did cohorts get larger over time. They almost always got smaller. And in every single country, we see outbreaks of new parties that were in pretty much the same range. I mean, in some countries, it was as large as 60%. In other countries, it was as large as or small as 20, 25%. But still, in every single one of these countries, by the end of the 6 periods, by 2019, we had a significant outbreak of new parties and a significant number of parties that had been created just recently. And we can look at the specific data for specific countries. We can walk you through that. We try to take those graphs and distill those down a little bit further into a single quantitative assessment. So a single quantitative unit, and the unit we ended up using was one that was derived by Velo Petai and Marcus Kreutzer, the weighted party age index. And you can see here, actually, the magenta line that cuts through is the line that we used at our level 4, which was the standard line. But actually, the other lines, the dotted lines, reflect the higher and lower levels of scrutiny, so the more and less strict levels of what qualifies as new. So you can see that the same patterns existed there. And what we see is in every single one of these countries, a slow-moving average age that does not rise as fast as the average age of the country itself. So all of these begin in roughly 1990 and they move up. If the party system was created and stayed the same, it would have gotten older at the same rate that the country was getting older. So that 45-degree line. But what we see in most of these countries is sometimes they get close to that and then immediately at a certain point abruptly stop becoming older because old parties die and new parties replace them. In other countries, they get older, but they get older at a slower rate than the system is old because some old parties die and some new parties emerge. So we see this pattern in every single one. You know, in some countries, the party system stays remarkably young. Slovakia's party system, as Tim and I were joking, Slovakia's party system has been 10 years old ever since the country was about 15 years old. In some other countries, we get a sort of slow growth. In other countries, you get a rapid transition, like in the Czech Republic, which was getting older at the rate of the country getting older. And then suddenly the party system stopped getting older, and it looks to be continuing to do that right now. The last thing we did was to make sure that we weren't overdoing the averages. Averages tend to be responsive to particular kinds of numbers, but they tend to obscure other kinds of things. And so we wanted to make sure that we weren't trying to lump countries together. You can get a middle-aged party system by either having a whole bunch of middle-aged parties or by having a bunch of old parties and a bunch of young parties. So we actually then not only looked at the party age, but we looked at the distribution of parties. So we adapted a mechanism for looking at the distribution between young and old. What we found is that, you know, some of those parties of middle age, some of those like Poland were actually composed primarily of middle-aged parties, whereas others like Slovenia were actually composed primarily of parties that some of which were old and some of which were new. So in addition to that age, we also want to pay attention to that. And we also want to pay attention to how parties sort of got to where they were going. So how did parties occupy particular areas in that space by moving up or down, new parties emerging, old parties disappearing. What we then wanted to do was to figure out why this was happening. What was the underlying mechanism that caused these kinds of changes? So we spend 2 chapters of the book looking at the differences between parties in 2 different categories. In the first, we look at the differences, the systematic differences between old and new parties. And in the second, we look at the systematic differences between parties that live and parties that don't. And we do it on 3 different measures. So we look at organization, we look at issues, and we look at leadership. And we find a certain amount of strength in particular kinds of organization, particularly on the ground organization, parties with members. These seem to have a certain kind of ability to prolong party existence. Margaret Tavitz has certainly researched this in extraordinary depth, as have a whole bunch of other scholars who found similar results. We find a kind of durability of parties that exists around issues that have a certain permanence, in that they don't immediately prove you wrong. By picking the wrong side or having certain characteristics, the party doesn't suddenly suffer. And we looked at the ability of parties to change their leaders when the leader had become compromised in one form or another. So parties with these qualities tended to endure over time, whereas parties that tended to have a different kind of organization, really an organization based around websites, based around social media, based around followers rather than members, parties that tended to emphasize corruption as the main issue that they were fighting about, and parties where one leader was sort of fixed in place, these tended not to survive. And that this was the kind of difference between those two different sets of political parties. And we found, when we looked at it, that parties created earlier tended to have the characteristics that we see on the strong side, that parties created later tended to have the characteristics of parties on the weaker side. And really what this means in practice is that the later parties were formed in Central and Eastern Europe, the more they tended to have characteristics that would make them more vulnerable to further disruption, to further problems, to further rapid decline in popularity. And what that means is that you end up with a systematic process of new parties being born, but new parties being born at a disadvantage. Some of these characteristics are actually great for getting started in the first place, getting over that initial hump. So if you can use social media, you can organize a lot of people very quickly without a lot of investment. That's great. If you can emphasize the corruption in the system, you can get a lot of attention very quickly. That's great. If you can organize around a particular celebrity, you can actually rocket to the top of the polls. But if you can't convert those followers into members who will stick with you, if you can't find a different issue that will support you once you've been proven to be or even presumed to be corrupt, and if you can't get rid of your leader when that leader starts behaving in ways that are inconsistent with the party, you're going to face significant decline. And that's what we found in a lot of different parties in the region. And actually, only very few parties among those newer parties figured out the ways to actually adapt. So Borisov's party in Bulgaria, Gerb, managed to do it for a while. Robert Fico's party Smer in Slovakia managed to do it. There were a few others, but almost none of those parties actually adapted those mechanisms. They tended to stay in this space rather than to develop and to modify. Even these parties actually haven't yet learned the art of getting rid of their leader. And with Slovakia Smer, we've seen the results of that just in the year since the book was finished. But unless parties learn how to do that, they seem to face pretty significant demise. So parties created later were stronger on all of those indicators. Parties earlier were stronger. Parties created later were much weaker, with the possible exception of leadership. And here it's not one of those factors that always points in the same direction, but having a leader who is strong, having a leader who is clearly in charge of the party can get you to a certain point. But in almost every case, at a certain point, that leader becomes more of a liability than an asset. And unless parties can actually act to get rid of that leader at that point, they're going to stop the asset and they're going to only have the liability. So we found this linkage between the old and the new, the living and the dead. New parties basically adopted characteristics which made it more likely for them to die quicker. And that led us into the question of how are parties related, the new and old parties related, and how is party birth and death, how did those two connect in a kind of systematic way? This idea that newness is endogenous, that newness generates even more newness. Our underlying framework for this, and actually this is something we've been working on for over a decade, we've been seeing over a decade, is that, in an ordinary party system with, say, the standard two dimensions, you've got left-wing and right-wing economic parties, you've got green alternative left parties and traditional authoritarian national parties. Those parties tend to remain relatively stable. But you also have in Central and Eastern Europe the emergence of a new dimension of competition, a dimension between those parties that are clean, that are claiming everyone else is corrupt, and pretty much everybody else. And what we've seen over time is that this dimension is not a stable one. The other two dimensions are fairly stable, but in this one, we get something different happening. We get parties emerging, parties that are unable to sustain their reputation for cleanliness, that fall into that space of corruption and lose and create a new space for a new party, which emerges as clean, and that cycle keeps happening over and over again. We started to see this pattern as early as 2005, 2006, 2007, but we started to investigate it more deeply and actually look at the numbers of those parties. So to look at how those parties changed over time, and also to look at the internal numbers of their followers. And here we used a combination of ecological analysis and of retrospective questions in public opinion polls, both of which are dodgy in their own ways, but which actually support one another. So we actually have a pretty strong confidence that these potentially problematic methods are actually measuring the same thing. What we found are a certain set of patterns. Some patterns for new party emergence and new party disappearance actually don't cause the kind of problems that we're seeing. And these are often the ones that we see with the emergence of new parties in Western Europe, at least before about 2010. So one of those patterns, we'd see the emergence of a new party, and then the death of that new party, and the voters would return back to the parties that they used to vote for before. So they would come from inside the system or outside the system. They would vote for a new party, the party would disappoint, and they would return either back outside the system or for the party that they used to vote for. Or we could also see a pattern we called stabilization, where a new party emerges, voters are pulled from both outside of the system and from the established parties, and they stick with that party, and it actually ends up becoming part of the established system. What we started to see in Central and Eastern Europe was actually something rather different. We started to see what we call a subsystem of new parties, so that parties would emerge, they would draw people from both established parties and outside the systems, but those parties would disappoint. And the voters, some of them would return back to where they came from, but most would move on to the next wave of parties. And those parties would disappoint. And those voters would move on to the next wave of parties, and so on, and so on, and so on. So you have a constantly declining number of voters for established parties and a larger and larger group of voters for newer parties in one form or another. That was the hypothesis. What we were able to do was to look inside the voting numbers and where voters were moving from to, and we actually found really distinct patterns, striking patterns of institutional movement among parties. So that to use the Czech example or the Slovene example, in both of those, you see the emergence of new parties that disappoint, that never quite achieve at that same level. They always get a little bit smaller. Some of those voters return to the older established parties, some return out of the electorate, but huge numbers move to newer and newer parties. And ultimately what you have, and it's really clear in the case of Slovenia, is a kind of pump that consistently pumps voters away from established parties into ever newer and newer parties. And so that's the kind of pattern that we're seeing, and we see this across the board. In addition to looking at individual voters, both ecologically and through public opinion polling, we were also able, thanks to the help of Jakob Stauber at Charles University, to develop an agent-based model that we used to actually test this with really huge numbers of simulations. And what we found was when we simulated the patterns that we were finding, we saw almost exactly those same patterns. So when we built a simulation where voters moved from old parties to newer parties, we were able to replicate with almost picture perfect identity the kinds of patterns that we see in Eastern Europe, the distribution of new parties based on party age and the distribution that I talked about earlier. And when we changed those parameters, when we reduced the availability of new parties, or when we reduced the flow toward new parties, or the overall flow in the system, we saw systems that stopped looking like Central Europe and actually started looking like Western Europe. So we were actually able, by changing those parameters to Western European style parameters, to produce a model that yielded Western European style party systems. So we have a pretty strong confidence that this is actually the mechanism that we're seeing in a whole variety of ways. So that's the mechanism, that's the issue that we're seeing. We're seeing this development of an ever newer party system in these countries that's not based on sort of random instances, but actually seems to now be based on new parties creating even newer parties by their own death. And we're not only seeing this in Central Europe, but as Tim's going to talk about, we're seeing something like the Slovene example all over the place. Tim.
So thank you, Kevin. Excellent as ever. So just to say that obviously our study was focused on those 11 states of Central and Eastern Europe. But as we were working on them and reading about other party systems across the globe, we seem to be seeing similar kinds of processes. Now, we are scholars of Central and Eastern Europe. We haven't conducted primary research in these other places, but we think that these kind of arguments that we're making may well help explain the development of party politics and of new party politics in a number of places. There are a number of countries across the European region that this slide illustrates that we think that at least some of the ideas can translate and to help explain. We wouldn't necessarily say that it will replicate elsewhere, but we think a bit like kind of, to paraphrase Mark Twain, we think it may not repeat itself, but it rhymes at least elsewhere across the globe. So here are some examples across Europe, and just to flesh it out with one case, here is the case of Iceland. So this is the Icelandic party system, and you can see towards the right hand side of that the emergence of lots of new parties. And moreover, when we use the data from the election surveys in Iceland, we see a similar kind of process in Iceland in the same way that we saw in the Czech Republic and in Slovenia. But it isn't just across Europe. We also see, we would suggest that there are similar kind of processes at play in countries as diverse as Peru, South Korea, Japan, Guatemala, Benin. Some might even suggest the United States and the UK. Maybe we'll leave that to one side, but happy to talk about that in Q&A if anyone wants. But finally, and I'm conscious of time, let me just say something broader. So you might think, well, so what? So what? Who cares about these movements of parties? What does it really mean? Is it just for sad, nerdy party scholars like Kevin and me? Does it matter? Well, we would suggest that actually it's worth reflecting on the positives and negatives for broader questions of democracy. So in the positive side, actually thinking about new political parties, we could emphasize the fact, Kevin, we can emphasize the fact that they can help remove corrupt and incompetent politicians from power. They can rouse established parties from their complacency. They can help societies respond, politics to respond to changing societies, and they can re-engage citizens, going back to Political Parties 101, Dick Katz and the like about the role of political parties. But of course, we might say on the negative side, all of these new parties, they can bring to the equation, for example, politicians who are driven by egos. They can help to create a cycle by which, secondly, that they can help raise expectations and then dash them. They institutionalize these newness. And third, and crucially, we would also suggest it's important in terms of public policy. Really good public policy is about long-term time horizons, but novelty and institutionalized novelty shrinks time horizons and leads to a poorer quality of public policy. And so, to link it back into bigger questions, I know people like Anna have written and discuss a lot of these questions about challenges to democracy and democratic backsliding. And we may think about the far right or politicians like Orban or Kaczynski, or think about communist threats in one or two places, one might argue. But we at least want to suggest that if we want to think about the health and well-being of democracy across Central and Eastern Europe, it's really important for us to reflect a little bit on the emergence of these new parties, the emergence of these cycles of new parties, and the fact that many of these parties are not living for very long. So what kind of a challenge does that pose to democracy? And that final challenge leads us in, sorry, we were 3 or 4 minutes over what we should have been. And our final challenge is really now to throw it over to you and hope that we meet your challenges that you pose to us in your questions. So thank you very much, Anna and Shannon. Dzięki, dziękuję, and we look forward to your questions.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Maybe Kevin, if you could stop sharing the screen.
Absolutely.
But wonderful. And then if you have any quick questions, please put them in the Q&A, and I will sort of serve as the question translator. I'm going to abuse the privilege of being the host of this meeting and ask you to talk more about the causes of the churn, right? Because one of the sort of big takeaways at the end is that we are seeing this in Western democracy, in Western European democracies as well. So is this a question of the original sins of post-Communist Party development, or some kind of a convergence between West and East? And in either case, what are the underlying causes? Why don't we see more of a settling down? Why do we keep seeing this churn? Why do we keep seeing this replacement?
Do you want to take that one first, Kevin? Or?
Sure. So I think when we've looked at this, we've looked at it in two ways. So we've looked at the influences that come from the outside. We talk about this in the book. We didn't want to spend a lot of time here. But there are certain things in the fundamental underlying landscape of political parties that have changed in the last 30 years, things that have nothing to do with the collapse of communism. So the emergence of radical new forms of organization that are much more efficient, that are much quicker, but that are also much lighter and much looser. The emergence of significant resources in terms of money that are available to political parties that weren't available before income differentials and inequality has risen in certain kinds of ways. So we're seeing that as well. We're also seeing a shift in the global media environment and the role of celebrity, so that particular individuals have an outsized status when they enter the political realm. And a lot of the people that we're seeing forming these new parties are people who were in a prior life famous in one way or another. And so, we could just see from the original list that we showed you, who's on that list. We've got a former king who's famous as a celebrity in that sense. We've got a game show host. We've got an entrepreneur. We have a whole variety of other people that we didn't focus on, but we could look at. We've got rock stars. We've got TV psychiatrists. We've got investigative journalists. That there are people who come at it from the outside. And the path to political success, both in the East and in the West, in the United States, elsewhere, is no longer that path up through political parties and that path up through the political process or the political system. So we have these global changes that are going on, and it just so happened that the Central and Eastern European party system emerged precisely as these things were happening across the world, and those systems emerged without the kind of institutional constraints / institutional strengths that characterized the Western European political party system. So those new forms emerged. In Western Europe, you had parties that were already quite strong, parties that already were fairly fixed in their ways, that were able to dominate the electoral environment without necessarily using those approaches, and were able to keep others out. And this is where Katzenberg, talk about cartel parties and so on. So we've got a system where these new techniques and these new ways are emerging. They're adopted a lot more quickly in the East because of the lack of resources and the new forms. And so they take root a lot sooner, but it's not that much of a time period before they start to take root in the West as well. And so that's why we think we're seeing what's going on in the West is sort of catching up, and those institutional barriers to these new methods being adopted are now finally allowing those challengers to actually be strong enough to challenge the existing party. The other thing we want to point out is the reason that they are emerging is because each death produces the incentives for new emergence. So, when you see these systems full of new parties, those parties, in a sense, generate their own continuation. So some of it's coming from the outside, but once it's in a system, it's very hard to take it out of the system. And one of the great examples that I think we see in the West, the best example in the world of an Eastern European party system is Italy, where you see a system that just by accident collapsed at around the same time that communism collapsed. And it's indistinguishable in almost every way from the kinds of patterns that we're seeing, at least with regard to new party formation and so on. It's virtually indistinguishable from the parties that we see in the East. So some of this, tiny bit of this, is the original sin of communism, but a lot of it is just the circumstance new political party systems emerging at precisely the time that these winds are blowing and changing party systems all over the globe. Long answer to your short question. Sorry about that.
I can see there's quite a few questions in Q&A. I'm quite happy to. Kevin gave a great answer. I'm quite happy to address some of these questions in Q&A if you want.
So here's following up on what we just talked about. There's a question here about party rebranding, right? So to what extent, this is a familiar pattern, for example, in the United States, where a party sort of rebrands itself and becomes very different, and it's not just a question of sort of a superficial change, but more of a more fundamental change. Do you see evidence of that? And are these parties more or less successful?
Do you want to take that, Tim?
Yeah. So, I mean, actually, sorry, Kevin, can you quickly take one? Sorry.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, what I would say, so one of the things we actually did when we were looking at standards of party newness was to rank parties, in a degree of how much they change. And so, we have our 6 levels. The third of our level, just below the kind of standard that we use for newness, involves significant internal change in parties. So we are seeing quite a bit of party rebranding, some of it quite radical, some of it very, very subtle. We see a lot of name changes. We see some sort of shifts in party identity and party ideology. So I will say what we are measuring is actually only at the level of explicit change, but we are also seeing below that yet another layer. So actually the phenomena we're describing is thicker, is deeper than what we're just using here, because underneath our layer of newness, there is yet another layer of newness which does incorporate that rebranding, and that has some of the same positives for the parties if they're successful at it, but it's hard to rebrand. It's interesting that the rebranding actually in some ways is a space that allows you to maintain institutional continuity. It doesn't seem to have that effect on time horizons that is so negative with new parties, because if you can rebrand, you can survive to the next generation and so on. So in a way, rebranding is sort of what we would hope for from parties that are otherwise stuck, rather than the current cycle that we're seeing of huge numbers of people fleeing to new parties because they can't get their way, people giving up, voters giving up, politicians giving up, closing up shop. So the rebranding is there. We see it as a phenomena. It's that layer underneath what we're seeing. Ideally, that would actually be a nice option for parties, but it doesn't seem to be the predominant choice. The predominant choice seems to be sort of sticking with what you got until it collapses and then starting something new.
Great. So we have 2 questions on the politicians themselves, right? And so the first question is, is there something about sort of these unprofessional politicians that basically discourages them from investing more heavily in party organizations? And the other one is about the background characteristics of politicians. And do some politicians stay in the game longer than others? For example, do female politicians get knocked out of the game sooner than the others? So what does the personal characteristics of the politicians have to do with this?
So, I mean, I would say that, what is very, very striking is a lot of these new parties, the people who form them don't have much by way of a political hinterland. They don't have much by way of political experience. That becomes a real challenge because, as we know, that actually governing is really hard. It's difficult to make those particular decisions. It's particularly difficult to deliver on certain sets of promises. So the anti-corruption appeal in particular, which is very, very easy to conjure up, is extremely difficult to deliver in practice, and it's very easy to disillusion your voters. Also, just the nature of democratic politics is about deal making. It's about working out to navigate your way through the complex bureaucratic system in order to get decisions done. The problem is a lot of these politicians, particularly if they have backgrounds as businessmen, for example, thinking, I say it should happen, they find it extremely difficult. Or those who just have no experience of politics whatsoever find it an incredibly steep learning curve for them to do. Now, what's interesting, I mean, you mentioned about female politicians. It's actually quite striking that there aren't that many cases of new parties where female politicians have been at the forefront. There are one or two examples. From Latvia for the Heart is one that immediately springs to mind. And I remember interviewing her in Riga, and what was again extremely striking about her was that she emphasized how she came into politics thinking that she as an auditor would know how to run everything and she could get everything done. But she said she found it extremely difficult to actually do politics. So, you know, one of the broader stories about this, I can see one question that's there in chat is asking about ways out of this. And one of it is for people to realize how difficult politics actually is, and dampening down some expectations of what can be delivered by politicians would be quite helpful. The problem is the incentive structures of politics are such that you don't get many votes by downplaying what you can do if you were to get into power. So it becomes very difficult to break that kind of cycle.
No, that's great. I think, if I am not mistaken, and your point, Anna, I think is a really good one. I think we have still yet to have a single woman complete a term as prime minister in the entire region. I'm trying to think. I know Estonia just elected a woman as prime minister, but I think there has not been a single case yet in the entire region of a woman being allowed to finish her term, and that's a huge problem. And Tim's right. You don't see many sort of women leading these parties. I'm tempted to say it's a sign of a certain sensibility on one gender that doesn't exist in the other one, but I don't know if that's too broad a generalization.
That sort of brings us about another question from the chat. So how do we reverse this trend? I mean, short of cutting off access to celebrities and social media.
So, well, one of the first things that we would say is actual existing new parties that emerge, they can change, and we have suggested there are a couple of examples of those parties transforming. Now, we may not particularly like Robert Fico and Smer, but it's an interesting story to look at about how what was a new party, new faces, new directions, how that solidified itself on the political spectrum. And it did that by partly moving away from a strong appeal based on newness and anti-corruption and rooting itself, going back to the diagram of competition, thinking about the fact that they essentially projected themselves as a party of the center left and against the neoliberal policies of the then Slovak government. Secondly, they also invested very heavily in organizational structures. So parties can survive by doing those sorts of things. And actually the kind of message in a way to new parties might be, well, as soon as you kind of get a foothold in parliament, you then need to start to be doing these kinds of things. I saw someone in the chat was also asking about different parts of the world. I mean, one of the bodies of literature that I certainly found, or we found very useful for looking at Central and Eastern Europe is actually Latin America. So the work of people like Jennifer Sia talking about ideational and organizational resources, the work of people like Noam Lupu, the work of Rosenblatt and others help show why some parties are able to kind of endure. Ultimately, and I would say that, we emphasize the importance of agency and choice. So ultimately, this comes down to politicians themselves making these choices. We just have to keep emphasizing that these are the choices that they need to be making. But what was interesting in a number of conversations with politicians when we were interviewing them, they recognized that organization different sets of appeals, not being based, having an appeal wrapped up too much in a particular leader's personality was actually going to be key for them to endure.
And I would just, if I could just add one thing that's really interesting about this is that, you know, the people who could, if there was an easy way to stop this, the people with the strongest incentive to stop this are the people in power at the moment. So anybody who's in parliament has an incentive to keep new parties from emerging. And over the course of 30 years, nobody has managed to stop really the emergence of new parties in any of these countries, except for one example, which is Hungary. And so, you know, the cure there is close down the political system completely, and the cure is so much worse than the disease. So, you know, I think there really is no kind of good or easy way that we've seen that anyone sort of figured out how to stop this. And so what we actually talk about in the book are compensatory mechanisms. And we talk about the importance of civil society organizations. We talk about the importance of citizens themselves understanding that the next new party won't necessarily bring the kind of magical change that they anticipated. There is a question in our minds that we don't know yet, and we haven't seen enough cycles. Is when do citizens have enough? You know, when do they say, well, the last 3 new parties that suddenly emerged and promised to solve the problem didn't, so maybe we don't vote for the 4th one. You know, our presupposition when we started the book was that this was something that would emerge and it would die out. So we would be writing a story about a time period that would eventually have an end once people realized and stopped behaving, voting in that way. But nothing we've seen, and one of the questions was, what have we seen since the finishing of the book? I mean, if anything, since we finished the book, the cycles have gotten more, just the year and a half, the cycles have gotten more extreme. We've seen major party birth and death and splitting in Slovakia. We've seen a new party emerge in Croatia. We've seen a new party emerge in Lithuania. We're seeing new parties emerging, potentially 2 new parties in the new Bulgarian elections. And so, you know, nothing that we've seen suggests that voters are getting tired of this. If anything, they're getting a little weirder about this. I mean, both Croatia and Bulgaria have kind of turbo folk singers as the, you know, the predominant alternative to the leading candidates. So, you know, it doesn't seem to be shifting. And unfortunately, we seem to have written a book about something that's ongoing rather than something that's done.
So what does this mean for the quality of democracy, right? I mean, if you have voters who aren't punishing parties that make extraordinary promises that they can't fulfill,
right,
and you have party elites with no incentive to, you know, be more reasonable and dampen expectations, is this, you know, sort of a ratchet runaway train towards a diminution of democracy, or is it just simply a new style of competition?
I mean, it's certainly the latter. Whether it's the former, to some extent, yes, it does seem to be. As Kevin, though, also, you know, pointed out, and it is worth bearing in mind, and that's why I had that slide with both the positives and the negatives. It is sometimes quite a good thing that we are seeing new parties emerge. You know, if we look at some of the party systems like Hungary, where there's been dominance of one party for a long period of time, that's not necessarily particularly good for the quality of democracy. One could argue that Romania, you know, that because of the clientelistic links of the Romanian parties, Romania being pretty stable for a long period of time, that wasn't actually good for democracy. The problem is that it's not a simple yes or no kind of answer to that question. It poses challenges for democracy. It poses different sets of challenges, but we should be aware of those different sets of challenges and be aware of the negatives that it brings to the occasion, the equation. I mean, particularly, you know, in terms of, I mean, something that we only dwell on a little bit towards the end of the book. And actually, I think we need to do more on this. And I know, Anna, you wrote a great article about time and politics, but thinking about time horizons, particularly in terms of policy making. What's interesting is there's some good work by Simmons, which talks about time horizons and linking that to political parties, and talking in his book, which he looks at Asia, he talks there about the way in which if a party looks as if it's going to survive for a long period of time, then the upcoming generation has an incentive to think for the longer term. The problem with new parties, especially when we're seeing that they are they have such short lives, what's the incentive for a politician who isn't right at the top, but is kind of second rank, to actually stick with that party? Why not break away, form your own new party, and try to solve the world immediately, or claim to do so at election time? So it's a kind of mixed picture. It brings different kinds of sets of challenges, and those are the things that we need to reflect on and think about if we're thinking about the challenges to democracy in the region. Sorry, that's a very long-winded answer, but hopefully there was something in there.
No, so what does bring to mind, usually the story is of incumbent politicians doing everything they can to solidify power and to retain that incumbency. And so we would expect that some of these incumbent politicians, as one of the questions just suggested, would do things like impose electoral thresholds, higher registration requirements, more sort of reporting requirements for parties, all in an effort to limit the number of new entrants, so they could hold on to power. Why don't we see them do that?
They have done it to some extent, but I think what these politicians learn from one another, they learn in other places, and it actually turns out to be very, very difficult to do. And in many countries, what we've seen is the emergence of kind of parties that are taken over from within. So you can ban the emergence of new parties, but you can't keep politicians from taking over the registration of another party. I guess you can. No one had thought of it. Maybe that'll be part of the strategy now. But many of these parties, the initial movements are so significant. When you're starting to talk about a politician who can declare himself a candidate and immediately start at 10 or 15% of the polls, it's going to be really difficult to develop legal remedies that are going to keep those kinds of people out. And increasingly, that's what we're seeing. We're not seeing new parties start at 2 and build up to 4 and then build up to 8. Oftentimes what happens is you get a deadlocked political system, a lot of political frustration, and somebody says, I'm going to fix it. And immediately they come into this with kind of voting resources, not very long term, not very stable, but such big numbers that even under fairly strict registration requirements, it would be hard to keep these folks out. So, part of it is just the nature of the issue itself, and where those restrictions have been in place, like in Romania and elsewhere, politicians have fairly easily found ways around it. It seems a little bit like money in politics, sort of new faces in politics or new parties in politics. It kind of seems to find its own level. You really have to lock it down pretty tightly, like Hungary has, in order to seem to keep this out. But that is a great question for our next research, along with the stuff on time horizons that Tim's talking about. So this is just the start. We got, both of us have a couple decades left of life in this field, hopefully, and I'm actually so fascinated by this that this is where I'm going to be, I think, for the rest of my professional life, because this is amazingly interesting stuff.
Fantastic. Well, on that very optimistic note, and may there be more than just 2 decades, I want to thank both Tim and Kevin for the fantastic presentation and a fantastic book. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today here via Zoom. It's actually not that great right now. It's pouring rain out here, so you're not missing anything by not being out here in California. Take care, everyone. Thank you again.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.